So, welcome, Emily. And, before we begin, tell me about how did you get into farming? Are you from the area? Are you?
I'm not. So I'm originally from Ohio, and my husband's from Indiana, and I grew up in a farming community. So my father is a farmer, but he's a conventional farmer, so he does mainly corn and soybean, which is then sold to the state. So all those lovely GMO products like that, are subsidized by the state, and that are also, they don't get very much money for what they actually, and it's not food for people. It's not, it's either going to ethanol production or it's going into, he did a lot of corn as feed for animals that then we would eventually eat, but their feed, which is a lower quality than what we would eat. So my dad did a lot of that. So I did grow up in sort of that landscape of farming, but it's very different from the farming that we do. In fact, when my husband and I, we met at the College of Worcester, which is in Ohio, and we moved out to New York together after we graduated. He was a musician, so we originally came to the area and lived in Manhattan because he was pursuing a music career. And we did that for 5 years together, and he found a lot of success, but it was a lifestyle that we really weren't interested in. We spent a lot of time on the road without a home base and in a tiny apartment in Manhattan. And I think both of us growing up in the Midwest wanted something that was more open and more community oriented. So we started moving up into the Hudson Valley, and when my husband wasn't playing music, he was working at a brewery called Captain Lawrence. And when we decided to do our own thing, I said, what do you want to do? And he's like, well, I really enjoy brewing. And I said, well, I was working for Riverkeeper, which is the environmental nonprofit that protects the Hudson River. And I have a geology degree, and I spent a lot of time in the environmental sciences. And so I wanted to do something where I wouldn't be sitting in a cubicle. And I wanted to do farming. I wanted to do, and we do practice, or not certified organic, but we practice organic. And we are now entering a phase where we're going to try to be a no-till farm as well, which is pretty interesting. We work a lot with Ben Dobson, who has a great farm. It's called Stonehouse Farm in, I think it's Hudson or Livingston. It's a 300 plus acre all organic grain farm, which when we decided that we were going to start our brewery, we wanted to be 100% New York State ingredients only, and our goal is to one day become 100% sustainable as well. So that's a goal that we're working towards. And in the process, as we were gearing up to start our brewery, at the same time, the state passed the farm breweries license, in which the local New York State government had decided that agritourism in the Hudson Valley specifically was something that they really wanted to focus on and focus funding on. And in the process, they made this farm legislation for craft beverage makers, so cider makers, distillers, and brewers, to try to stimulate the agro economy around the beverage industry. And so in the process, we went to a lot of grain conferences that the state was holding, and other, like the Carey Institute put a few of them together to try to motivate farmers and beverage makers to come together and have conversations on how we could improve the quality of ingredients that were being grown in the Hudson Valley, the quantity, in order to feed the craft beer industry on the other side. And so when we went to all these different grain conferences and we talked to a lot of farmers, they got really excited because there's a premium they can charge for their product because it's different than grains that you spray. Because I guess there is spraying involved, even on the level of the barley grains, but it's a specific type of barley you have to grow for the brewing industry. It has to be low protein, high sugar. It's usually a 2-row, that's mainly what's grown in the Hudson Valley, but we happen to be using a 6-row barley from Stonehouse Farms that is 100% organic because it's a 100% organic grain farm. And going to conferences prior to us opening our brewery, every grain farmer we spoke to in the Hudson Valley and north and into the Finger Lakes said that organic grain growth was not possible, that it was not possible, that you will not get a yield that's sustainable. And thankfully Ben Dobson is working on, who works at Stonewest Farms. It's a Rockefeller estate, so it's kind of one of those farms where they have money, so they don't need to worry so much. I mean, they make money, but they don't need to worry so much about making sure that they make enough money to survive because they kind of have a cushion, which is great because they were able to experiment and figure out what worked without having to be profit driven, which is really difficult in farming. In all farming is, making sure that the end product makes enough money that it covers your costs, which is why so much farming is subsidized. Because that balance is very, very difficult. But Ben Dobson has been doing a great job. He's recently been telling us about, he does no-till as well. He does, it's called crimping. So he puts down, he'll put down something like clover or hairy vetch, something that kind of acts as a ground cover. To help with weed suppression.
Wait, so can we step back, because...
This is a lot of verbiage.
No, just so that we're all clear.
Okay.
What is tilling?
Oh, so tilling is, we have a rototiller, and it's a thing that goes on the back of our tractor. It's got all these kind of blades and gears in it that flip over the soil. So you can choose how far down you till, and that'll basically turn over and kick up all of the soil and break it apart and make it more permeable. And what it does when you till is it releases a lot of the natural gases and things that are suppressed in the soil. It actually opens up the soil and it loses a lot of nutrients, and then just makes the soil more susceptible to any sort of seed that wants to come in. So if you're tilling and you want to plant a specific kind of seed because you're trying to grow, barley or wheat, when you open up that soil, you're disturbing the natural biome of the soil, and at the same time, you're making it vulnerable. And any seed, so weed seeds as well, things that you don't want, will get into the soil as well, which is a traditional way of farming. I mean, a lot of places till. It's just easy when you break up the soil. To then impregnate it with whatever it is that you want, but then you have all these other things that come along with it. But if you can sustain the biome of the soil and not disturb it, it's more nutrient rich. You don't have to treat it with as much organic or fertilizers or spray because you're not opening it up and making it vulnerable, and you're keeping it fully intact. So if you do a no-till, the way that we're going to try to do it this year as well is we planted winter rye and we heavily seeded it. So it's already started to come up now in the spring, and it's so dense that there are no weeds because there's no room for the weeds to live within that area, because we just, with the winter grain especially, you kind of get ahead of the weed season, and the grain had established its roots very well going into the winter. So there was just no room.
So you try to avoid tilling so as to get out the need for like pesticide or herbicides and weed, suppressing. Is that it?
Yeah. So we've never sprayed pesticides or herbicides on the farm. It was the farm that we purchased. It might be interesting to know. In the town of Poughkeepsie, our farm is one of 5 farms that are in the town of Poughkeepsie, and we are the last farms left that are agriculturally districted. So the state acknowledges that we are ag zoned and ag district, but we're the last section left in the town. I don't know, I guess Poughkeepsie Farm Project must be, it must be ag district as well.
Yeah, and of course it's private property. It's Vassar.
It's private property, yeah.
Yeah, and we've got to keep that, I guess, open space.
Got it. Yeah, so as our last little kind of area back there, we know from the history of that farm that it was never conventionally farmed. So it's very hilly and very rocky. So it's not ideal for anybody who wants to grow traditional crops back there. It was always used for livestock. So my neighbors both have cows, and then it used to, I guess in the 1950s, be one of the largest pork providers in Dutchess County. So it used to be the pork. There used to be pigs that were on that farm. And then I know that it was a horse farm in the 60s and the 70s, and then it's been abandoned since the 70s. So looking back at the history, we decided, well, it hasn't had pesticides or herbicides in the ground at any time. So that and the biome there is great because it hasn't been disturbed. Nobody's been tilling, and everything that grows there, it's in such it's so nicely balanced that everything's kind of found equilibrium, and so we didn't want to disturb that too much because nature had come in and done a really great job already of regulating and making the soil biome very nutrient rich and balanced. So we didn't want to mess with it too much. We did till last year. We did a low till. We only tilled it, I think, twice, and that was because the main pasture that we're using, which is about a 4-acre spread, had cows on it for over 20 years. So it was very heavily compacted with manure. And so it's so nutrient rich that we kind of needed to break it up a little bit. And but this year, so we planted our cover crop in the fall. Our winter rye has come up, and now we're going to direct seed and actually green growing, I guess, is what it's called, where we're going to then do lines of corn, heritage corn, between the rows of the winter rye, and just see if those companion, kind of like using those crops together, will benefit both of them.
So just to back up then, so your husband was saying, let's start a brewery, and you were saying, what were you wanted a farm, and so you found this area, how? Like you were looking for like close to the city, or were you interested in like that particular parcel? I mean,
Sure.
Is there like a real estate agent of farms or something that you?
Yeah, so there's places like FarmLink where they try to link people together with farmers who want land, people who have land that want it farmed, and so they can try to hook people up, and we kind of started down that avenue. We ended up renting a piece of property in Fishkill. We moved there in 2012, and it was just a 1-acre plot. It had a house and a little shed on it, and it butted up against this open, I think Scenic Hudson owns it, it's huge open preserve. So we started there because we felt like before we went big, we wanted to make sure that our ideas were going to flesh out. So we were in what we called our petri dish phase, where we started a 1-barrel brew house, which is 31 gallons per batch, super small. It's like we bought like a industrial kitchen stew pot, and my husband fabricated machines that would become our brew house out of this. And then we foraged the property behind us for ingredients, and we had raised beds on this 1 acre, and we did hops, and we did a small amount of grain. And so we just kind of tried it all out to make sure before we invested any more of our time and money into it that it was going to work out, because no one has ever used 100% local ingredients before. There are a few larger breweries that have farms, and they'll do a couple one-offs where they try to use local ingredients, but to date in the US there's not a single brewery that has dedicated themselves to 100% local ingredients or 100% sustainability. So we're like, there might be a reason people don't do this. Maybe we should flesh it out, invest a small amount of money, and see where it takes us. So we started out in Fishkill, we rented the property, and then after 2 years, after going to grain conferences and talking to farmers in the area, the products started to grow. So our first iteration of the brewery, we had to drive up to a guy's house in Oswego, and he was malting barley that he grew in his backyard. He was malting it in a fish tank in his living room, and so that's how we got started. but that definitely wasn't sustainable, so we had to,
Oswego's far away.
yeah.
When you said you foraged for ingredients for that first scratch, what do you, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So we would forage for anything that we could find growing. Behind us we had wild blackberries, wild raspberries, muscadine grapes. There was a Japanese, on the property it was a Japanese peach. I can't remember what the exact name of the tree was. So we would forage the peaches off of the trees that were planted back there already. We would still use barley. So the four main ingredients of all beers in order to make them beer is grain, usually barley, water, yeast, and hops. So we kind of have to start with that as the base, but then we did a lot of fruited beers. We started with commercial yeast, so we would just buy yeast strands, which is how most commercial breweries work right now. You decide what flavor you want to get out of your beer and you buy that strand. But yeast is a naturally occurring organism, and it's all around us all the time. It's that film you see on fruit is actually yeast, which is kind of clinging on to, they like to eat sugary things, so they're looking for sources of food. And so when we first started, we said, well, you know, we started with commercial yeast, and then we said, well, it's really important if we're going to be using all local ingredients, that instead of using a Belgium yeast strand that comes from Belgium or a Saison yeast strand that comes from France, we should really be using local yeast. So when we were foraging, we were taking some of that fruit, and we were, I have some pictures
Okay,
of
so
it.
should we look at this? Okay.
We were culturing yeast off the fruits. But the only thing about that was that we found that the flavor profiles were so closely tied to the fruit. So when we were using the peach skins, everything kind of tastes like a Berliner Weiss. When we were using the muscadine grape skins, everybody was like, this has such a wine characteristic to it. I'm like, yeah, because the yeast came from grapes.
All right, so she made a very nice PowerPoint presentation, so let's just,
So this is the entrance to the farm. We always try to work with local craftsmen as well as we. The sign was made by a friend of ours who's in the Hudson Valley, and she does steel work, so she made this sign for us. And this beam that it's attached to is one of the beams that we pulled out of our barn that's on the property.
where are you located? Like from here, how do you get there?
So if you go down Raymond Ave, and you follow it, you just keep going until it kind of runs into North Grand. Off of North Grand, across from the St. Peter Cemetery is Underhill Road. It dead ends into our farm. So it's probably less than 3 miles as the crow flies from here. So it's very close.
Okay.
These are our bees. So we put in, when we started the brewery, we actually, we got some inspiration from a friend of ours who started his own honey company, and then the byproducts, so we made soaps and lip glosses and all sorts of stuff from the wax. And we thought that if we were going to start our business, we were going to have to start big, that we were going to have to get a big loan, and we were going to really have to go for it. And he was the one who had said, no, you know, I started with 1 hive. When I made money off of that, I got a second hive. When I made money off that, I bought 3 more hives. And so he had really inspired us to try this petri dish phase. And he put bee boxes on our property the first year that we moved to the property. And we started getting involved with having bees there so that we could forage the honey for our beers. And it wasn't until about a year into the process of brewing beer that we were cultivating our own yeast off of these fruit skins, and we realized that they were too closely tied to the fruits. And then my husband had said, wait a second, bees forage in less than a 3-mile radius, and they're touching upon fruits and flowers all over, and they're collecting a very diverse, microbiome from the entire area of bacteria and yeast. What if we, need is just basically honey that's diluted so that the yeast and things that are captured in that honey can then ferment. honey is such a low moisture content that the yeast that's trapped in it can't ferment through because the content of the sugar is so high that it kind of preserves the yeast and it's not able to eat and grow and multiply. But if you dilute the honey, it'll ferment and become mead. So my husband was like, why don't we just dilute the honey and then use the yeast cultures that we get off of it in order to ferment all of our beers? And that's what we do now. So every single one of our beers are fermented from the yeast and microbes that we cultivate from our raw honey. So these are the bees on our current property. And then this was just opening up the hives and pulling out the frame. So this is one of the bee boxes turned on its side, so you can kind of see how all the frames fit in there and how the bees fill them up. And then the one on the right is an actual, that's all honey. So all of that is capped honey, except for the far right corner. And so I'll pull out a frame every spring and every fall and we'll cultivate our yeast from the harvest. So we'll use the same culture for 6 months until I do the next harvest, and then we use that for the next 6 months.
How big is that? This that we're looking at here?
Sure, so that frame is probably, I don't know what the standard frame size is, but it's probably 2 feet by like 18 inches, 24 by 18 maybe.
And how much, you say once a year you'll pull one of these, twice a year you'll pull one of these out?
Yeah, it's about 10 pounds of honey off of one frame if it's filled.
And how much is that then, like, how much beer does that contribute to?
So when we do a batch of beer now, we have a 10-barrel brew house. It's 310 gallons per batch. We usually put 120 pounds of honey in that batch to flavor it. But if we're using this culture in order to produce the yeast, I only need a cup of honey. Like, I don't really need that much to get it started. So we have an Erlenmeyer flask that sits about this high. We dilute it in distilled water, and then we put it on what's called a stir plate. And I think I have a picture of that. Yes. So this is a tinier version of it. So this is an Erlenmeyer flask, and it's sitting on a stir plate. So inside of this is a motor and a mechanism that turns, and then we drop a little wand that has a magnet in it inside the Erlenmeyer flask, and it spins around and it aerates the liquid. So yeast wants sugar to eat and oxygen. So if you keep your yeast happy, it'll multiply very quickly, and it will give you a nice, if you have angry yeast, it's going to give off flavors, which you can identify in beers that you've had, the different off flavors that you can get from angry yeast. So it's all about keeping the yeast happy. And this is very happy yeast.
What angers the yeast?
If it's too cold or too hot, if they don't have enough food, which stresses them out. If they don't have enough oxygen, it stresses them out. They like to keep around like ale yeast likes to keep around 68 degrees, 68 to like 72, 74. So there's a little window in which they're most happy. Oh, this is our coolship. So on top of using only local ingredients and the yeast that we cultivate ourselves, we try to brew our beers in sort of an old world style, pre-modern technology. So this is called a coolship, and what it is, it's a big open vat. And before the technology of today, which is a plate chiller, which is kind of this mechanism that you have beer going one way and cold water going the other way, so as you pull the beer through it, or the wort, which is the hot sugary liquid before it becomes beer, if you pull it through the plate chiller, instantly it cools it in place, so you can pump it from one place to another, and then it's at that pitching temperature for yeast, which is around 68 degrees is what you want the beer to be. But in the olden days, before they had that technology, they would put it into large open vats, and then they would just let the ambient temperature around it cool the beer down slowly. And in that process, once it gets to pitching temperatures, the ambient yeast, which is always around us, finds that sugary liquid and begins the fermentation stage for you. And there's a thing called spontaneous beers. These are beers that don't have any yeast pitched into them. They just rely on the ambient yeast that exists. Or if you put them into wood, it's also all the yeast and bacteria that lives in that porous wood that comes out, starts eating that sugary liquid and converting it into alcohol. So yeast eats sugar and it poops out alcohol and burps out CO2. So that's it transforms the sugars in the, yes.
Just like taste wise, like, is there a difference between like doing the slower process and then this fast modern one?
Sure, so we do, I guess they're kind of called dirty beers because they, it's a, you know, there's a lot of different things that are converting the sugars. Not only is it yeast, but there's also souring bacteria like lactobacillus, things that you find in yogurt. So most breweries, if they want to have a true to style like Pilsner, for example, they're going to use a Pilsner yeast and they want that beer to be clean. They don't want any influence from other yeasts or wild bacteria. And so it'll taste like a Pilsner. It'll be crisp, it'll be clean, it'll have like a very distinct flavor. With our dirty beers, the wild beers, with all of that microbiome in it, you get beers that range from tart to full-on sour. So the flavor is definitely different, different than a true to style like true to style beer. If that's what if that's what you're trying to capture is that flavor. We're kind of yeast shepherds in which we kind of let the yeast do their own thing and we just try to keep them happy. So they really provide the flavor profile of all of our beers, which are very complex. They've got lots of layers to them and lots of different tasting notes that go in a lot of different directions, and tart. They go from tart to full-on sour.
So they're like tart Pilsner type of things? Are these still Pilsners at this point?
No, so they're all considered wild ales because they are not true to style in any like category. So they're not a pale ale because you need pale ale yeast. They're not a Pilsner because you need Pilsner yeast. They're not a Kolsch because you need Kolsch yeast. So the styles of beer that we know are so closely tied to the yeast, and yeast provides a large amount of the tasting profile of every type of beer that you enjoy. So like lagers are cold ferment. So then that's a whole other thing. So there's lager yeast and there's ale yeast. So ale yeast likes like warm temperatures. Lager yeast likes cold temperatures in order to ferment. So like, I'm gonna buzz marketing. Budweiser, those are lagers. Those are cold fermented beers, and they're meant to be light and crisp, and they use a totally different type of yeast. And ales, which are on the other side, which ferment warmer, and they have more, they're probably gonna have, they're going to be a little fuzzier. They're going to be a little more rounded on the palate, unlike the lagers, which are just meant to be clean and crisp and cleanse your palate. And so we're using all. There might be wild lager yeast, but it's probably in our mix. But it's we would like to plate it and see if there's wild lager yeast naturally in this area. But for the most part, we know that it's probably mostly ale yeast profiles, and then souring bacterias and all sorts of different bacteria that like to eat sugars as well.
Is there a lot of risk in this kind of brewing technique? Do you ever like get a batch of beer and you let it all sit and you're like excited to try it and just like bad yeast in the air of that batch and ruin the whole
This
thing?
sounds like there's so many ways this could go wrong.
Yeah, of course, and that's why I think a lot of breweries are not interested, because it's the unpredictability of what you're going to get, which is why we call ourselves yeast shepherds, because we just try to keep them happy, but we know that it's not up to us. Like, it's completely up to, and even the seasonality changes what kind of bacteria you get. So like in the summertime, it's really hard to brew beers and do the coolship thing, because it's warmer, so there's more bad bacteria in the air. Everything kind of wants to become acidic. So acetobacter is like this bacteria that makes vinegar. So your beer can very quickly turn to vinegar, which you don't really want that. And then on top of that, the actual bugs like flies and gnats and things like that that are really active in the summertime, they want sugary liquids too, and so they all kind of flock to this. So we try to brew a lot in the cooler months We still brew in the summer months, it's just harder, and you have to be quicker, and you always have to have your pulse on what the beer is doing, and tasting it, and taking readings, and so a lot of our beers actually age between 3 months and 12 months, because if something seems like it's going in the wrong direction, if we put them in oak barrels and bung them up, it's really like it's a war for resources. So you've got this sugary liquid that's providing a lot of food for bacteria and yeast, and they're all fighting in order to multiply and have their tribe win against one another. So they're constantly competing for resources, but you can kind of change the playing field a little bit in favor of those bacteria or yeast that you want over those that you don't want, based on ranges of temperature, based on access to oxygen, based on, if we put it in wood, we know that our wood is already seasoned with bacteria and yeast that we want, which will overtake the bad bacteria and things that we don't want. So sometimes if a beer is kind of going in the wrong direction, we'll put it in oak and bung it up and see if that improves the situation. Sometimes it doesn't, and we just have to throw it out. Sometimes the bad bacteria takes a foothold and we can't win out against it. But time is our best friend, because the beer will clean itself up, in a sense, once once the yeast and the bacteria that we do want gain a foothold in that liquid. So it's interesting. And beers taste different. We'll do the same style from year to year sometimes, but it'll taste different every single year. So I tell them it's like wine in that sense, is that you get a vintage. The grapes, 1 year had too much sun or not enough sun, or not enough water or too much water, and it changes the yeast and the taste profile of that fruit. Same thing with our beer. If there's enough time and access to resources, it'll change from year to year. But okay, so this is the barn that was located on the property when we purchased the farm. On the left is what it looked like when we got there. On the right is what it looks like now after we've renovated it. So that was another project that we took on, was that we wanted to keep the original barn.
And this was a cattle barn?
It actually had pigs in it and then horses.
Okay.
Yeah. My neighbor had cows on our property, but his barn is on his property, so he would take them over to his property. Had a lot of structural issues that we had to fix, but on the left, in the main hall there on the left, that's where the production facility is. And then on the right side is where the tasting room is going to be. And then in the basement where you saw the coolship, that's filled with oak barrels, where we do our long aging, which is in the cellar, so it keeps kind of that cellar temp that we want between 68 and 74. So this is our coolship. So we did a beer with another brewery that came to visit us, where we foraged for all the ingredients. So this is the liquid on the left, is the wort, the unfermented beer that we brewed, that is down in the coolship cooling. You can see the steam coming off of it. And these are all the ingredients that we foraged on our property. So we have a 25-acre farm, and we try to keep most of it wild. We have a 4-acre wild orchard, which was unplanned. Our neighbors had a pick-your-own orchard in the 40s.
An apple orchard?
An apple orchard in the 30s and the 40s. But in the 50s, they cut down the orchard and they threw all the debris over the dividing wall between their property and our property.
Nice.
And because of it, you can actually see on photos that they take of the area on Dutchess County parcel access. You can see these aerial photos of how the trees just started growing from that wall and kind of came out. So we have a wild orchard. The apples are if you want a true to style, like if you want a Granny Smith, you usually have to, apples they have to be cross-pollinated. So, but if you want a true to style, there's a lot of grafting that goes on and controlling of the fruit. So when we tried to have our orchard classified in some way. The apples are 100% unique because they're so cross-pollinated with one another that they're no true to style apples at all.
So they're just apples.
They're just mainly crab apples is what we have. So we threw crab apples in there. This is Queen Anne's lace, which is on the closest corner to where I am, which has a nice flavor to it, and the seeds, when it goes to seed, it becomes what they call wild carrot seed, because when you eat it, it tastes just like carrots. We have some anise hyssop in there, lemon verbena, lemon thyme that we grew. Then there's all sorts of leaves, bark. We have a wild pear tree on the farm as well. We threw some pears in there, and then I put fresh honey straight from the beehive in there as well, and it became this really delicious tea-like aroma that was coming off of it. It's a really nice beer, very tart beer. And then this is some of the farming that we did last year. So on the left, this was us doing a little bit of tilling in order to break up all of the manure that we had already that was well decomposed on the property. This is, in the center is the corn that we grew. So we went through a seed saver and we got some heirloom seed varietals. We got Bloody Butcher, which is red, Ohio Blue Claridge, which is blue, and Reed's Yellow Dent, which is a yellow corn. And we planted them last year and harvested them in the fall and made a couple beers out of those. And we saved our seeds from that harvest, and we're going to plant them again this year. And then on the top right is the pumpkins. We grew Long Island cheese pumpkins. So they're a pumpkin that looks like a large cheese wheel. They're supposed to be one of the better eating pumpkins. They have a lot of really good flavor in them. So that was one of the 3 pumpkin harvests that we did last year as well. And then on the left here is our pepper haul. So we had pepper plants that we grew. We have cayenne, ghost, jalapeno, habanero, hot Portugal, and we made one whole beer with all of those called Pepper, and it was a spicy beer. It was very good. And then on the right here is summer squash that we roasted outside over hot coals. So we have a lot of wood on the property, built a huge fire on top of rocks, and when those rocks were nice and hot, then we put all of the squash on top of it, kind of had this fire roasted quality to it, and then we threw that into our mash tun and put that into a beer as well. Some of the different projects that we do on the farm.
Who's your photographer? Because the photographs are very nice.
That's my husband and Instagram. He's taking it with his cell phone. This on the left are some of our bees. So when we mash out our grains, which I don't know how far you want me to go into that process of what it takes in order to brew a beer. But on the left, the spent grain, so you kind of make a tea out of the grain. So you take the grain, you mill it, which cracks all the hulls and opens them up. We put them into what's called a mash tun, which has a false bottom on it. So it's kind of like, it's the same concept of like a French press. So you've got your grains in there in a filter, and then you pour hot water over it, and then all the sugary liquid comes out of the grain, and we pump that into the boil kettle and use that as the base of our beer. But with all of the spent grain, so we usually use about 500 pounds of barley and some other adjunct put together. When we're done with it, we scrape it out of the mash tun and we compost it on site, which our bees actually really like to go and take the remaining sugars off the grain. And they'll eat those, and then we also provided a food source for probably 150 turkey this winter, and I don't know how many hundreds of deer who have just kind of flocked to our area in the winter, and they will...
The compost?
The compost of the grain, and they will go through that pretty quickly. And then on the right you see this is one of our beers in our glass, and there's a bee on the glass as well, enjoying the that we provided. So this is what our bottles look like. This is the finished product. So we use kind of like a craft brown paper label. That's our logo in the center, Plan Bee Farm Brewery with the B. And then we wax dip all of the bottles for long aging if you want to lay down the bottles, but they also just look pretty. But Plan B, the name, came from two places. One, Plan A was my husband was going to be a musician. I had to come up with Plan B. And then our bees are really doing the work for us. We brew the beer, but it would just be sugary liquid if it wasn't for fermentation. So they're really doing all the work foraging for our yeast that makes our product into beer and makes it into alcohol.
And so tell us about the varietals, because these are
Sure.
all wild ales.
They're
like
all
you
wild
said,
ales.
But you gotta, I mean, people pick it up and they're like, I don't know what that means. So
Yeah.
you gotta like give them some hint, like,
Sure.
do you say it's Pilsner-like, or, what, so tell me about the names and how they vary.
Sure. So on the ends is Carnage and Carnal. Those were our cherry beers that we did. We worked with a lot of different farms in the area as well for things that we can't grow. So cherries are something that we don't grow, but they taste great in sour beer. It just naturally kind of goes together. So we did Carnal, was with Montmorency cherries. We got them from the same farm that Mama Fuko gets their Montmorency cherries for.
Do you guys know Mama Fuko? It's like the
New York.
top restaurant
Yeah.
Okay.
in New York.
Yeah. And so Montmorency cherries are a tart cherry. So a lot of pastry chefs will use them because they go really nicely to balance out the sweet with the tartness that already exists in them. So Carnal was a Montmorency cherry. We used about 400 pounds of cherries and we aged them right on the fruit. And so that had a really nice cherry, but almost mouth-puckering sourness to it between the beer itself and the sourness that came from the cherries. And Carnage was on the other side, so we used Balaton cherries, which are a sweeter, darker fruit-tasting cherry. And we did that with some roasted malts that we got our hands on, so it was a dark beer that had a lot of like chocolate characteristics to it in the flavor profile, and then it was kind of like a chocolate-covered cherry where it was like sweeter and chocolatey. Wild Mountain Honey is our honey beer that we do, so it's like a mixture of 120 pounds of honey and barley. And we don't use any adjuncts in that. Crystal clear, really nice honey profile to it. It varies from year to year how tart it gets. Like last year it wasn't very sour or tart at all. The year prior it was very sour. Again, that's just the yeast and what's going on with it and the time of the year that we brewed it. Dandeliaison is a fun one that we do. It's honey and dandelions, and we're about to do that beer because dandelions are the first nectar source that come up for our bees. And so it's a liaison between the nectar and the finished product, which is the honey. And they come together to make this very nice kind of grassy, a little bit floral. Dandelions, we use just the flower heads, but the leaves themselves, sometimes we use a little bit of those, and they act as like a little bit of a bittering agent, which is similar to when you add hops to a beer. It gives that nice kind of bitterness to it. Royal Jelly is a big beer that we do. It's like almost 10% alcohol because we...
That's a lot.
That's a lot. It's because we use a lot of honey and a lot of grain, and then we age it in freshly dumped whiskey barrels. So it has a nice flavor profile of oak and whiskey and honey, and it's got a lot of booze in it. So it's just it leaves a bigger impression on you. It's not, Dandeliaison can be really like refreshing and like palate cleansing, and that slight tartness and a little bit of bitterness, and it gets you coming back for more, where Royal Jelly is kind of like a little more on the sweeter end, a little bit more on the boozy end, a little bit more on like, I'm gonna put this in a little glass and sip it.
And these are all in wine bottle size bottles, right? So that's like 3 pints or something?
Yeah, so it's, this is a 750 milliliter, which is just over 25 fluid ounces. So if you're doing 16 ounce pour, it's gonna be, not quite enough for that.
Yeah, but you wouldn't want 16 ounce pour for
No.
Royal Jelly.
No, that's a sharing one. We now do our barn beer, which is our barn beer is like our flagship beer. It's a quicker turnaround beer. It doesn't age as long as the rest. And we really tried to encapsulate the flavor of the barn. So it gives a very good impression of what our barley tastes like that we use, and then yeast, because there's not a lot of time for it to develop. It's kind of like a quicker beer. And we do that in the 375 milliliter bottles, which is 12.7 fluid ounces, which would probably be enough for our self-serving.
And so, what are these priced? Where do you sell them? How do you market this? I mean, this is a complex beer. This is not something like an amateur should wander into. It sounds like a lot of these are going to be more tart, and I know, for instance, I've heard sour, beers are, getting more in vogue, but still, they're not, your common, mass market beer. And it sounds like you're working that end of the market.
Yeah, so we're a small brewery. We will probably, hopefully this year we'll reach 500 barrels of beer, but in the grand scheme of breweries, it's very, very small. So when you think about, I'm trying to think of what kind of beer, like breweries you might see. I mean, Captain Lawrence is one that probably does 25,000 barrels a year. And they're still like a smaller craft brewery.
Captain Lawrence is in upstate New York.
It's in Elmsford, it's in Westchester.
Okay.
And then Newburgh Brewery, which is another one, they probably do about 5,000 barrels of beer a year. So 500 is very small. So we haven't done any marketing besides social media because we have such a small quantity of beer to play with that we don't have to sell a lot of beer. We were a brewery, so we've been around since 2013, brewing and selling beer, so it's been 5 years. And at the beginning it was, if you didn't see my face, you didn't get any beer, because I literally would sell it to you at the farmers markets or would invite you to the farm to buy it directly from us. Now, in the last 8 months, we've started limited distribution through distributors. So trucks will come, pick up a pallet of beer, and then they'll go hand sell it. And they'll sell it mainly to bottle shops and on-premise locations that we invite to the farm. They know our story. They can reiterate that because it is such a unique niche product that that I think if you just wandered to the store, picked it up and drank it, and be like, what is happening? Like, what is this? But really knowing the story behind it, understanding that everything is local, that the yeast is wild. I mean, it says that stuff on there, but it doesn't. You really need somebody to kind of do a little bit of hand holding until people understand where we're coming from and what we're doing exactly. Because it's most breweries are ordering ingredients from a catalog, and those ingredients come from all over the world. The grain is coming from Russia or China or France, and the yeast is coming from all over the world. The hops are coming from all over the world. New Zealand hops right now are really like hot in the IPA world. And there are trends that people are chasing, and there's a lot going on in the craft beverage industry right now. It's really exploded. I mean, there are more breweries in the US now than pre-prohibition, which is pretty significant in the growth of the beverage industry. And so we are working with a lot of more informed consumers that are concerned about where their beer comes from. The local born movement, which is a relatively new movement, where people are moving away from homogenized foods that are traveling from far away to get to us. They're more interested in where their food comes from, how it's grown, who's handling it. That also aids in what we're doing in our project, people that are just more concerned in that realm. So I think we hit the market at the right time. Yes?
So where can we find the beer? I'll see that kid.
So,
Well, of course, there's only a few of us that are over 21.
Yeah,
So
sure.
when you
Where
turn
can they find
21,
the beer? Where can
where can they find beer?
sure. So we're in the process of trying to open the farm
Yeah, so
to the
let's look at
public.
that.
Yeah, we're in the process of trying to open the farm to the public right now. if you actually look in the picture on the right, there's a little tiny wooden stand built right in the entrance because we weren't allowed to invite people into the building. So we were standing right outside of it, selling beer from the door. And technically, I still think we're still allowed to do that. But we're in the process of trying to get our certificate of occupancy so that we can invite the public into the building to taste inside, to see the brew house, and to kind of meander the farm. And so we're in the middle of that right now. And so as we're under the thumb of local government, we've kind of pulled back the ability for the community to come in until we kind of get the okay.
Because we have been talking about direct to consumer agriculture, and if it's not your face at the farmer's market, then it's not direct to consumer until you get something like this, right? Until the farm store, or in this case the
so that's
tasting
the
room.
goal. Yeah, that's the goal, is that you'll come to us. But in a measure to try to lure you in, we started doing limited distribution. So actually on our website there's a link that says retailers, and I put everybody in. So we're in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and Connecticut and Rhode Island. So we've added a section there, places that have now continuously reordered so that I can send you there, and most likely there'll be beer there. Is on our website. So I know Halftime in Poughkeepsie usually has it. And there's a lot of places in Beacon that have it, like Stock Up. Some of the restaurants carry us there. Heritage, which just opened, which is a farm-to-table restaurant in Poughkeepsie as well. They carry our beer there. Yeah, so we try to, through social media, that's usually where the places that carry us blast that they have it, and then we try to also blast that they have it so that you can find it. It's hard to find.
So what were the reasons for why you can't bring people in the public into the place?
So there are a few things. The barn was built in the 1830s, we think, so it's a very old structure which we have rehabbed. Under agricultural law, since it's just it's agriculturally zoned and agriculturally district, and it's just my husband and I who do everything. We don't have any employees. We are allowed to make improvements on the property and work inside that building without any permits, without any sort of certificate of occupancy, without any influence from the local government. There are a lot of rights that farmers, we're a part of one of the legislative groups that lobby for the rights of farmers, and so there are protections there.
Which groups are those?
That
Oh, you mean just you show up yourself, or are you with the organization?
So we pay membership for New York Farm Bureau, which is in the state of New York. They're a large lobbying group that work to protect the rights of New York farmers. And so Ag and Markets is also the New York State Department, which oversees agricultural processing facilities and farmers markets, and so they're the body and the government that makes rules, and but they're fairly lenient. Local government. So like, if you wanted to build a house, you'd have to go to your local government, and you'd have to go through the planning process. You'd have to go through the zoning board. You'd have to go through the building department, and you have inspectors who every step of the way are kind of making sure that you follow the codes as they're written through New York State's building codes. Our barn is very old, and it was a barn, so it was never meant to have the public in it. And so we are working in two sets of building codes. One is called the pre-existing building codes, so if something was already built when I got there and then I started changing it. And then new, like every year they come out with new rules and new building codes, and the book is like this big, and you have to, I don't sit down and do it, I hire an architect and an engineer who are more familiar with these laws and these codes, who try to help me bring it all together so then I can go and get the certificate of occupancy. But it's very complicated. I mean, it's different from local government to local government because they're interpreting the code they want to, and they're allowed to make exceptions whenever they want. So it's kind of like, it's truly local politics. It's truly local politics. And it's you know, if they don't want us here, they can make it very difficult for us. If they want us here, they can just, open the floodgates and just stamp things and be like, here you go. So we're working somewhere in between.
So what do they think though? Because you're part of that, you know, the 5 farms in this agricultural district, the last one in Poughkeepsie. Don't they think that's a good thing in general?
You would think so. However, we all apply for tax relief on our property because we're agricultural use. And the town doesn't like that because they have a set budget every year and they need X amount of dollars. And if I'm paying less taxes, then that means everybody else has to pay more taxes. And that makes us people don't like us. They just don't like us. They're like, that's not fair. You have 25 acres and you're paying less taxes than I am and I only have a half an acre. And it's like, yeah, but this is another level of protection because farms can't grow if they're taxed on their property because the taxes would be so high. Again, it's bringing back that, am I making more money than I'm spending in order to become a viable business? And this is one of those provisions to help farmers is to give them tax relief on their property because usually they have a lot of property.
And just to step back, so I'm guessing like that tax relief, that exemption that farmers and everyone who can register as a farm, that comes from the state, I'm imagining. And yet the taxes get collected and distributed
Locally.
to the county and the city, right? So the state, you know, in the abstract, and, you know, speaking for New York farms, they say
Yeah.
this is a good thing, and so we're gonna subsidize this. But then the local government sees
hurts.
this as sort of like an unfunded mandate. You gotta, you know.
And it's not easy to get ag exemption on your property taxes, and it's something you have to maintain through lots of paperwork every year. So it's not like it's like easy breezy, like you're a farm, here you go. It is complicated, and it's just another layer that we're dealing with.
And I imagine, you know, if you were in a different town that was more agricultural,
Sure.
they'd be much more understanding.
Exactly. The town of Poughkeepsie has a very big budget and it's very residential and, you know, it's a lot of working class families that it's gonna be hard on them if their taxes go up. And taxes are going up everywhere. I mean, this is from a federal level, if we really wanna talk about it, trickling all the way down to a state level, which then trickles down to a local government level. There are some really crazy things happening in the federal government right now that are going to be affecting all of us and our bottom line. So this is just a scary time, and for me to be like, and I'd like my taxes reduced on top of everything else that's going on, it can just get really hairy, in which they're like, okay, so I don't want you to get this exemption, so maybe I'll make it harder for you to become a viable business so that maybe you'll leave. And then maybe somebody will want to buy it and develop it into condos, and then we're going to get so much more tax revenue off that same piece of property. Yeah.
I'm not incredibly informed about this. Can you tell me about, you guys keep your bees, right?
Yeah, let's talk about the
Sure.
bees. Yeah.
So our bees come from Pleasant Valley. There's an apiarist there who is using a hybrid. They're a hybrid of Russian and Italian bees, and I think they're 5th generation now, which means that they've like, you know, they've.
Yeah, the population is unique, separate from.
Yes, so like a lot of people order bees from the south and then have them shipped to them in the north, and then every year when the bees die, they're like, why are the bees dying? I'm like, because these bees live in Georgia, they don't understand winter, like you can't relocate an animal and just be like, survive, like it doesn't work like that. I mean, some people find success, but that's only bees that are able to adapt well to the different kinds of, you know, mites that we have here, the different kinds of pesticides and herbicides that are being sprayed in the area, and their ability to adapt and survive in that kind of environment. So I wanted to go with somebody who was local so that I knew that my bees have already lived through the New York environment and that they had exposure to it to ensure their success.
How many bees? So first, how many boxes? Is that it? That's the hives? These are the
So I started with 6.
6 boxes.
I started with 6. After my first winter, I came out with 4. I split one of my hives and got back up to 6. Then My bees, I don't really find a high death rate. I find that they leave, and they like, I have a few of my hives that have swarmed, so they left the hive.
Like in a big swarm.
In a big swarm, they
went on
leave,
strike.
they left, and they are living in some black locust trees on our property because they like them better than the bee boxes. The bee boxes are that's again, modern agriculture where we're trying to take something that's, natural and make it kind of unnatural in order for our benefits. And the bee box is not a happy, great place for the bees. They don't love it. I mean, they'll tolerate it, and so there's this balance between me being a good landlord and making sure that they have all the resources and the comforts they need to be like, please stay, it's so nice here. Don't you like it over here? And then them just being like, well, this doesn't really suit my needs. There's something much better right over there. So a lot of my bees have swarmed. I went into this winter with 4 hives and came out of it with 2 hives. But again, I'll split those hives and try to eventually, I'll just keep trying to get back to 6. That's my goal. But,
So what does that mean? You've got like a queen in there, and that's what keeps them coming back, right?
so there's, sure, so the bottom box is the brood chamber, so that's where they make babies. And the queen can lay up to 1,000 eggs a day. And so they're considered a macroorganism where they are all communicating and working together in order to accomplish one thing. So all bees are female except for the drones, which don't leave the hive. They are larger, they can't see, they're pretty much blind. They're only used for reproductive purposes, so they're only used for their sperm. And then, so they're created in the brood chamber, and they only need, maybe a dozen of them at most, and so that the virgin queen will mate. There is some debate whether or not they need to mate more than once. Sometimes queens can mate once, and then from that one time, she could live for 3 years, produce millions and millions of bees without ever having to mate again. So as soon as winter comes, they take all the drones and they throw them outside to die because they can't afford to spare the resources. So every bee that you see is a female, and there's a queen, there's no king. And they all have jobs, and they work through sort of like this life cycle in which they'll start in the nursery with the brood, and then they might move up to cleaning crew. Well, they'll go through and they'll be in charge of cleaning the hive. And then there's a whole other set of responsibilities on receiving the nectar. They actually spit the nectar back and forth from each other, and then the enzymes in their stomach convert it into honey. There are bees that add water to the honey. There are bees that fan the honey so that the water content goes down and try to maintain it. There are bees that create wax that then create the comb. And then the end goal is to become a forager. So you would be the bee that eventually you work through all these jobs until you graduate to become a forager, and then you are sent out from the hive to go gather nectar and bring it back into the hive. And then that's the life cycle of a bee. Most in the spring, summertime, bees, they're workaholics, they'll work themselves to death, and their life cycle might only be 3 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks. And then once they winterize, they go into a hibernation-like state. They have to keep the queen at 98 degrees, so they form a super ball around her, and they flap their wings to generate heat. And then as it gets colder, the bees on the outside die, and then hopefully they'll be able to survive the winter, insulating her to make it through to the spring. And so those bees might have a longer life cycle, 6 to 8 months, but it's because they're not really doing a lot of activity. And then it just starts all over again in the spring. Yes?
Have you found the small farmer community helpful in starting up, or could you just talk farming in a place like Poughkeepsie where there's only 5 farms, what's the community like?
Sure. So so we work with so beer is a heavily agricultural product. So we work with grain farmers for our grain. And that radius in which we were receiving our grain has gotten smaller and smaller. So we were ordering grain well, first it was up in Oswego, and then up in the Finger Lakes, and then we've been able to now work with Stonehouse Farms, which is right here in the Hudson Valley. But when you're talking about adjuncts, like when you're talking about like fruits and flowers and vegetables and all that kind of stuff, yeah, we work with a lot of orchards. So a lot of orchards, and the best part about us working with local farmers and small farms is that the things that they would normally compost and not make any money off of, we can use that for beer, because it doesn't have to be market quality, and we like it when it's a little bit rotten, only because there's so much more sugar in it. So it's not rotten, but it's like too ripe, you know, when it's like mushy. Yeah, where it's like, well, I don't know, nobody's gonna wanna pop that in their mouth, like that's not the right texture. But that's perfect for beer, because the sugar content from the fruit ripening is so high, so we get more sugar yield out of it, which is good for us, beneficial for us. We've created a lot of really good relationships where I'll get phone calls from local farmers who are like, this product I was gonna compost, I'll sell it to you at a reduced rate if you come and pick it up. So farmers tend to like us because they're making money off us in situations where otherwise they wouldn't make money off of a product. Poughkeepsie Farm Project is another one. We became members of their CSA. Again, our whole mission and mentality is we're community-based. We make beer from the community for the community. So we try to be very interactive with the community. We're members of the Chamber of Commerce, CSA members. So I just started to get to know the people at the CSA at Poughkeepsie Farm Project, and I said, hey, do you ever have a product where people just don't pick it up? Would you be willing to sell it to me? So like we were about to come out with a beets beer, because through the winter shares, people weren't, you know, the CSA is you can pick what you get in your share. So it's not like here's a box, this is what you get. It's like this is the units you get, choose what fruits, vegetables, herbs that you want. And if there's something in particular that people are just not, they had a high yield of beets. Not a lot of people were picking beets for their units, so we made a beer out of their beets. And
Is it red?
it's very red. It's very red. And it tastes a lot like beets. It's really good though. I think it's really good. So we got like that nice sugariness from beets. People don't think, they only think of the earthiness of beets, but beets have a lot of sugar in them.
One last question, everyone? So,
What's your favorite beer?
what's your favorite beer?
My favorite beer. So previously we've been doing a lot of like, this is a quince beer and this is a beets beer, and it's like one specific thing. Now we're doing fusions a lot. And my favorite beer that we've done so far is a fusion of quince and black currants. It's called Zone 6, because that's the growing zone that we're in.
Do you have quinces around back there too?
We don't, but Mead Orchards has quince, so we'll get quince from them. And that's another fruit that people make preserves out of it because it's so astringent, you can't bite into it, you have to cook it. But the skin on the outside has this amazing tropical fruit flavor thing, almost like some sort of like sour green apple, but like a prepackaged gummy bear. Like it's not like a real, it's almost unreal, the flavor. So we use that, and then black currants, which is just this great citrusy, sour, fresh. It's really good.
Cool.
Well, I don't know about you, I'm hungry, but thank you so much for coming to our podcast. And if you have any questions for her, you know where the website is.
Yeah.
You can